Millions did not believe Hitler because his lies were logical. They believed him because his lies gave pain a direction. A defeated nation was starving for an answer. Why had Germany fallen? Why were fathers unemployed? Why did money become worthless? Why did humiliation sit at every dinner table? Hitler gave them something more dangerous than truth. He gave them someone to blame. Welcome to Dark Ages history, where the darkest moments of humanity still breathe beneath the surface of modern life. Subscribe and tell us which forgotten horror of history we should uncover next. Because tonight, we enter the terrifying moment when an entire nation stopped asking what was true and started asking who to hate. Germany did not collapse in a single night. It bled slowly, quietly, like a wounded animal crawling through the ashes of an empire that no longer recognized itself. November 1918, the guns finally fell silent across Europe. But in Germany, silence did not bring peace. It brought humiliation, a silence that speaks volumes. Cold, suffocating, heavy as wet soil thrown onto a coffin. The Kaiser was gone. The monarchy shattered. Soldiers returned from the trenches with mud still trapped beneath their fingernails, only to discover there was no victory waiting for them. No glory, no gratitude, only hunger. The records lie sometimes. They speak of treaties, borders, reparations, but under the dust of official history we find something else. Shame, raw, breathing, infectious. Germany had not merely lost a war, it had lost dignity. And humiliation is one of the most dangerous emotions in human history, because people can survive poverty, they can survive ruins, but humiliation poisons the soul. The Treaty of Versailles landed on Germany like a public execution. Territory stripped away, colonies taken, military dismantled, impossible reparations crushing the nation's throat tighter each year. Newspapers called it peace. Millions of Germans called it betrayal. A betrayal signed not only by foreign powers, but by their own politicians. That wound never healed. It festered. By 1923, the nightmare deepened. Hyperinflation spread through Germany like a disease eating reality itself. Money became paper. Paper became trash. Families carried entire baskets of banknotes just to buy bread before prices changed again by sunset. There are records of mothers burning stacks of worthless cash inside stoves because money produced more heat than it produced value. Think about that. An entire civilization watching its economy rot so completely that currency became fuel. A silence that speaks volumes. Veterans stood in soup lines wearing medals from the trenches. Men who had once survived artillery fire, now trembling while begging for potatoes beneath grey winter skies. Their boots cracked, their hands shaking from cold and humiliation. And somewhere inside that humiliation, something began to change. Because a starving society does not ask who is right, it asks who can end the pain. This is the part history often misunderstands. Hitler did not create Germany's anger. He inherited it, fed it, shaped it, like a man learning how to conduct an orchestra made of human despair. Democracy, meanwhile, looked weak, fragile, embarrassed. Governments rose and collapsed in rapid succession. Street violence erupted between communists and nationalist militias. Every promise sounded temporary. Every leader sounded uncertain. And desperate people do not fall in love with uncertainty. They fall in love with conviction, even dangerous conviction, especially dangerous conviction. Under the weight of 1,000-year-old dust, we found a heartbeat, fast, panicked, vengeful. The German people were no longer searching for truth. Truth had become too complicated, too painful, too humiliating. What they wanted was meaning, a reason for suffering, a villain, a direction for their rage. And history has shown something terrifying again and again. When fear becomes unbearable, simplicity becomes seductive. That is when societies become vulnerable to men who speak not like politicians, but like prophets of revenge. Adolf Hitler did not enter Germany like a conqueror. At first, he entered like noise. A strange man with sharp gestures, a trembling voice, a failed artist with wild eyes and theatrical rage spilling from beer halls thick with cigarette smoke and desperation. Many Germans laughed at him in the beginning. The records lie sometimes, but private diaries tell another story. Some called him ridiculous, others called him embarrassing. And yet, history is filled with dangerous men who were underestimated precisely because they appeared absurd. Because while intellectuals mocked Hitler, Hitler was studying people, obsessively. The pauses between words, the rhythm of applause, the exact second anger became contagious inside a room. He rehearsed speeches alone for hours, practiced hand movements in mirrors, studied crowd psychology like a predator, learning the breathing patterns of wounded prey. Under the weight of 1,000-year-old dust, we found a heartbeat. Cold, patient, calculating. Hitler understood something terrifying about human beings. People do not want complicated truths during chaos. They want emotional certainty, and certainty is intoxicating, especially to frightened people. The rallies were not political meetings. They were psychological rituals. Darkness swallowing enormous crowds, torches flickering like veins of fire beneath cathedral-sized night skies. Thousands standing shoulder to shoulder, breath turning white in the freezing air, waiting. Not speaking, just waiting. A silence that speaks volumes. Then Hitler would arrive slowly, deliberately, never rushing, every second designed to increase tension. Witnesses described the atmosphere like a religious ceremony more than a speech, people trembling before he even spoke a word. That was the real performance, anticipation, because fear and hope are strongest when suspended together. And then the voice would begin quietly, almost fragile, not screaming yet, just pain, humiliation, betrayal. He spoke like Germany itself had been wounded personally. Like every starving worker, every unemployed father, every forgotten veteran had finally found someone willing to scream their humiliation out loud. This is the part many people still misunderstand. Hitler did not speak to intelligence. He spoke to emotion, to resentment, to loneliness. To buried rage men were too ashamed to confess openly. And once emotion takes control, facts become fragile things. Inside the crowd, people stop hearing themselves think. That is not poetry. It is psychology. Crowds dissolve individuality. Guilt spreads thin across thousands of faces until responsibility almost disappears entirely. A man alone may hesitate. A crowd rarely does, especially a crowd desperate to belong to something larger than itself. Germany in the 1920s was fractured, humiliated, isolated, but inside Nazi rallies people suddenly felt united again, powerful again, seen again. That feeling mattered more than truth. The records lie sometimes. They tell us propaganda convinced Germany, but propaganda alone is never enough. Propaganda only succeeds when it feeds an emotional hunger already starving inside society. And Germany was starving spiritually. Hitler understood theater better than policy, myth better than economics. He transformed politics into spectacle, banners, symbols, marches, chants echoing through streets beneath skies that seemed to mourn over Europe itself. Every detail carried psychological purpose. Even the uniforms, even the lighting, even the music, especially the pauses. Because silence can manipulate people more deeply than words. Then came the most dangerous transformation of all. The crowd stopped seeing Hitler as a politician and began seeing him as destiny. What becomes more attractive during chaos, truth or certainty? History already gave us the answer, and millions paid for it with their souls. Germany lost the First World War on battlefields soaked in mud and blood. But that was not the story many Germans were told afterward, because reality was too humiliating, too unbearable, too human. And when reality becomes unbearable, societies begin searching for myths strong enough to anesthetize pain. That is where the lie entered. Quietly at first, like smoke slipping beneath a locked door, the stab in the back myth. The idea that Germany had never truly been defeated militarily, that its armies had not collapsed from exhaustion, starvation, and impossible war. No, the story claimed Germany had been betrayed from within. By politicians, by communists, by Jews, by invisible enemies poisoning the nation from behind the front lines. The records lie sometimes. Official speeches spoke about patriotism and national recovery. But buried beneath those speeches was something darker, a desperate need to protect wounded pride. Because admitting military defeat would mean admitting weakness, and wounded nations fear weakness more than lies. So Germany chose the lie. Not all at once, slowly, like poison entering the bloodstream, one drop at a time. Newspapers repeated the myth every morning beneath skies heavy with industrial smoke. Beer halls echoed with whispers about traitors. Angry fathers repeated conspiracy theories at dinner tables while children listened silently beside candlelight flickering across exhausted faces. A silence that speaks volumes. This is how propaganda truly works. Not through one speech, not through one poster, but through repetition so constant reality itself begins to erode. The same accusation repeated 1,000 times, then 10,000, then millions, until suspicion became atmosphere. Under the weight of 1,000-year-old dust, we found a heartbeat. Fear, fear, looking for a face. And Hitler understood something terrifying. If you give suffering a visible enemy, people stop questioning the suffering itself. That was the genius of the big lie. It simplified pain. Germany's economic collapse, betrayal. National humiliation, betrayal. Unemployment, betrayal. Inflation, betrayal. Every complicated wound suddenly had one simple explanation. And simplicity is seductive to frightened minds, especially when repeated with absolute certainty. Children in schools were taught racial theories before they were old enough to understand death. Tiny hands raising flags beneath grey skies, while teachers quietly replaced critical thought with obedience. Maps changed. Language changed. Even morality itself began to shift, slowly, almost invisibly. Neighbors who had once shared bread during hard winters now lowered their voices when Jewish families passed by. Shopkeepers hesitated before serving old customers. Friends became cautious around friends. Not because everyone suddenly became monsters, but because fear had entered ordinary life. And fear changes the chemistry of human behavior. The records lie sometimes. They tell us Germany was hypnotized overnight. But the truth is more disturbing. Most people adapted gradually. That is what makes history terrifying. The transition felt normal while it was happening. Intellectuals saw the danger early. Some journalists warned about the poison spreading through the nation. Some professors recognized the conspiracy theories for what they were. But many stayed silent. Career survival, social pressure, cowardice disguised as neutrality. Because once a lie becomes emotionally useful to society, truth becomes dangerous. The lie survived because it protected pride. That may be the most important sentence in this entire story. Because people will defend comforting lies with frightening loyalty when the truth threatens their identity. And once a society ties its identity to a lie, defending truth begins to feel like betrayal. That is the moment civilizations begin walking willingly toward catastrophe, while convincing themselves they are walking towards salvation. By 1933, Adolf Hitler was no longer shouting from the edges of German politics. He was Chancellor of Germany, and something inside the country began to shift. Not suddenly, not with explosions, not with marching executions in every street. That is the comforting lie people tell themselves afterward. The truth is quieter, far more terrifying, because evil rarely arrives screaming. It arrives administratively. Stamped papers, signed decrees, quiet meetings behind polished wooden doors, while cigarette smoke drifted beneath chandeliers and rain whispered against Berlin windows like a warning nobody wanted to hear. A silence that speaks volumes. The records lie sometimes. They tell us dictatorship arrives through violence alone. But when we reopen the burned files of the 1930s, we discover something colder. Normalization. Step by step, law by law, silence by silence. In April 1933, Jewish business owners suddenly found boycott signs painted across storefront windows. SA guards stood outside shops beneath grey skies that seemed to mourn over Germany itself. Some customers looked uncomfortable. Some looked away. Most simply kept walking. Not because they all hated Jews, but because fear had already entered ordinary life. And fear changes behavior long before it changes belief. Teachers quietly removed Jewish children from classrooms. Doctors lost licenses. Lawyers disappeared from courtrooms. University professors were dismissed, while colleagues avoided eye contact in corridors heavy with suffocating silence. No screaming. No dramatic confrontation. Just doors slowly closing, one by one. Under the weight of 1,000-year-old dust, we found a heartbeat. Human cowardice. Soft, rational, ordinary. That is what makes this chapter of history so difficult to confront. Most people did not wake up one morning craving cruelty. They adapted gradually. A shopkeeper afraid of losing customers. A teacher afraid of losing employment. A priest afraid of attracting government suspicion. The moral collapse happened in inches, and inches are difficult to notice while standing inside them. By September 1935, the Nuremberg laws officially stripped German Jews of citizenship. Newspapers framed it as national protection. Bureaucratic language covered moral horror, like fresh snow hiding corpses beneath a battlefield. The records lie sometimes. Laws sounded orderly on paper. But beneath those legal phrases were families suddenly realizing their neighbors no longer saw them as human equals. Children who once played together stopped speaking at school. Friends crossed streets to avoid each other. Engagements collapsed. Doctors refused treatment. The country was learning how to isolate human beings emotionally before destroying them physically. That process matters, because genocide does not begin with killing. It begins with distance, psychological distance, a silence that speaks volumes. Churches hesitated. Some religious leaders objected privately. A few resisted openly and paid heavily for it. But many remained cautious, careful, afraid. Their sermons softened beneath the pressure of survival. And history remembers silence too, especially silence. History's darkest systems are often built by people trying to protect normal lives. That may be the most uncomfortable truth of all, because ordinary people often convince themselves they are remaining neutral, while neutrality quietly feeds catastrophe. In November 1938, during Kristallnacht, Germany finally revealed the violence hidden beneath years of propaganda and social conditioning. Synagogues burned beneath skies glowing orange with smoke and shattered glass. Jewish families hid trembling inside apartments, while mobs smashed windows and police often stood watching. But even then, many citizens still told themselves this was temporary, necessary, political, someone else's problem. At first, nobody asked citizens to kill. They only asked them not to interfere. And that is how moral collapse spreads through a civilization. Not always through hatred, sometimes through exhaustion, sometimes through fear, sometimes through the terrifying human desire to protect ordinary life, while extraordinary evil grows quietly next door. By the mid-1930s, Germany was no longer simply listening to propaganda. Germany was breathing it. Joseph Goebbels understood something ancient, something terrifying. Human beings do not experience reality directly. They experience stories, repeated stories, emotional stories. Stories powerful enough to invade the private corners of ordinary life. And by 1936, the Nazi regime had turned propaganda into atmosphere itself. The records lie sometimes. They describe propaganda as posters and speeches. But under the ashes of burned newspapers and shattered synagogues, we found something much colder. Immersion. There was no escape from the message. Radios sat inside kitchens where exhausted mothers cooked thin meals beneath portraits of Hitler, hanging silently against apartment walls. Cheap receivers called the Volksempfänger flooded German homes because the regime understood one thing clearly: control the sound entering a nation's living rooms, and eventually you control the nation's fears. Families gathered around radios while winter winds clawed against windows outside. Voices poured from the speakers like hypnosis, promises, enemies, pride, warnings, repetition without end, again, again, again. That is how lies stop sounding like lies, a silence that speaks volumes. In May 1933, books were burned publicly in university towns across Germany. Thousands watched flames consume the writings of Jewish authors, political critics, psychologists, philosophers. Smoke climbed into skies already darkened by nationalism and fear. Students threw books into the fire while bands played music nearby. Think about that image carefully. Young people smiling while knowledge burns. That is not merely censorship, it is psychological cleansing. The regime was teaching Germany not only what to believe, but what to stop imagining entirely. Under the weight of 1,000-year-old dust, we found a heartbeat. Conformity. Soft, seductive, deadly. By 1937 and 1938, propaganda had entered childhood itself. School books rewrote biology into racial mythology. Teachers measured skulls. Children learned anti-Semitic slogans before understanding morality. The Hitler Youth transformed belonging into obedience. Uniforms replaced individuality. Marching replaced questioning. And children began watching their own parents. Some even reported them. The records lie sometimes. They tell us dictatorships survive through terror alone. But terror is expensive. Fear works far more efficiently when citizens begin policing each other voluntarily. That is when propaganda becomes reality. Not when everyone believes completely, but when doubting publicly becomes dangerous. When every voice around you repeats the same fear, silence begins to sound like agreement. That may be the most frightening transformation in this entire story. Because truth did not disappear from Germany overnight. It became socially exhausting. Dangerous conversations whispered behind locked doors, friends lowering voices before criticizing the regime, journalists vanishing, professors adapting language to survive, businesses hanging Nazi flags not always from loyalty, but from fear of standing alone. And eventually performance becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. Identity becomes belief. That is the hidden machinery beneath mass manipulation. The propaganda worked because millions of Germans wanted emotional relief more than uncomfortable truth. The regime offered certainty in exchange for conscience, pride in exchange for obedience, belonging in exchange for silence. And many accepted the bargain, gladly. How many lies must surround a person before lies begin to feel normal? History leaves us clues, not through monsters, through ordinary people adapting to emotional pressure one day at a time. That is why propaganda remains dangerous in every era, because human beings still hunger for stories that simplify fear, stories that divide the world cleanly between heroes and enemies, stories that make uncertainty disappear, even when those stories slowly lead nations toward darkness, while convincing them they are walking toward salvation. By the late 1930s, millions of Germans no longer saw Adolf Hitler as a dangerous radical. They saw him as pro. And that may be the most uncomfortable part of this story, because people did not follow Hitler only out of fear. Many followed him because so the records lie sometimes. They reduce entire nations to brainwashed victims hypnotized by propaganda alone. But history is rarely that simple. Under the ashes of war archives and beneath the weight of 1,000, relief. After years of humiliation and economic collapse, Germany suddenly appeared alive again. By 1936, factories roared with activity. Unemployment dropped dramatically. Highways stretched across the country like steel arteries, pumping movement back into a wounded nation. The Autobahn became more than it became psychological resurrection. For ordinary Germans, these changes felt tangible. Men who had stood in breadlines during the early 1930s now returned home carrying wages. Mothers cooked fuller meals. Children saw fathers smiling again beneath kitchen lights dimmed by years of despair. A silence that speaks volumes, because suffering clouds morality. and relief can make people dangerously forgiving. The regime understood this perfectly. Nazi propaganda did not only promise revenge, it promised stability, order, national pride restored after the humiliation of Versailles. Hitler appeared constantly in photographs beside workers, factories, roads, cheering crowds. Germany no longer looked defeated. It looked powerful, and power is intoxicating to wounded societies, especially societies desperate to believe their suffering had meaning. By March 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Many feared war, but France and Britain hesitated. No invasion came. Instead, Hitler returned home to celebration. Crowds flooded streets beneath skies, trembling with banners and torchlight. Church bells rang. Strangers embraced. For millions watching, Hitler no longer seemed reckless. He seemed chosen. That moment matters deeply, because success silences doubt faster than censorship ever could. The records lie sometimes. They tell us morality collapses only under terror, but often morality collapses under victory. Human beings forgive cruelty when cruelty appears successful. People forgive cruelty when cruelty appears successful, and success kept coming. In March 1938 came the Anschluss. Austria absorbed into Nazi Germany while enormous crowds cheered Hitler's arrival in Vienna. Flowers thrown toward motorcades, tears of joy, voices screaming his name as though salvation itself had entered the city. The world saw aggression. Many Germans saw destiny. Under the weight of 1,000-year-old dust, we found another heartbeat: belonging. That was Hitler's greatest weapon, not hatred alone. Belonging. The regime gave millions of people something emotionally addictive, the feeling of being part of a reborn civilization, marching confidently toward the future. Uniforms, flags, rituals, shared enemies, shared pride, shared identity, and belonging can anesthetize conscience with terrifying efficiency. Jewish families disappeared from professions, political prisoners vanished into camps, synagogues burned after Kristallnacht in November 1938, beneath skies glowing red with smoke and shattered glass. Yet many ordinary citizens looked away, not always because they approved, but because life finally felt stable again. That is the dangerous truth. History whispers through burned documents and ruined cities. Prosperity can make cruelty easier to ignore. The regime did not only sell hatred, it sold hope. And when hope becomes emotionally tied to power, people begin defending the system that gives them purpose, even while that same system slowly devours the humanity around them. In the end, the most terrifying part of Hitler's rise was not the speeches, not the flags, not even the camps waiting silently behind barbed wire and smoke. It was how ordinary everything felt while it was happening. The records lie sometimes. They tempt us to imagine history as something distant, a separate species of evil committed by monsters, easily recognized from the safety of the future. But under the weight of 1,000-year-old dust, we found a heartbeat. Human, frightened, lonely, desperate to belong. That is what makes this story unbearable, because the road toward catastrophe was built from ordinary decisions, bureaucrats signing papers beneath yellow office lamps, teachers changing lesson plans, journalists repeating slogans they no longer fully believed, citizens lowering their eyes in train stations while families disappeared into sealed cattle cars beneath skies that seemed to mourn over Europe itself. Tiny compromises, tiny silences, tiny acts of surrender repeated millions of times until the entire civilization drifted somewhere dark without fully noticing the moment it crossed the line. And maybe that line never announces itself. Maybe that is the real horror. A silence that speaks volumes. Would we have resisted? Or would we also have chosen the comfort of belonging over the burden of truth? Would we have questioned the slogans repeated by every newspaper, every neighbor, every authority figure surrounding us day after day? Or would we have wanted simple answers too, simple enemies, simple certainty? History leaves behind uncomfortable evidence. Human beings are tribal creatures. We hunger for identity, for safety, for meaning during chaos. And when fear enters society deeply enough, morality often becomes negotiable. That is how lies become nations. Not because everyone believes fully, but because enough people decide believing is easier than resisting. By 1945, Germany was rubble. Cities burned beneath skies blackened by smoke and ash. Children wandered through ruins carrying empty buckets. Mothers searched collapsed buildings for bread and bodies at the same time. The empire that promised glory ended surrounded by silence, starvation, and graves. Was it worth the cost? The question still hangs over history like smoke refusing to disappear. And yet the shadows did not die in 1945. That is the part we rarely want to confront. Because propaganda still feeds on fear. Tribalism still rewards outrage. Crowds still confuse confidence with truth. And human beings still crave stories that transform uncertainty into emotional certainty. The uniforms change, the technology changes, the slogans evolve. But the psychological machinery remains terrifyingly familiar. Civilizations rarely collapse because evil people suddenly appear. They collapse because ordinary people slowly stop resisting lies. That is the final terrifying answer. Millions believed Hitler's lies not because they were uniquely evil, but because they were human. And history whispers one final warning through the ashes. The shadows do not disappear. They wait, quietly, patiently, for another frightened society willing to trade truth for comfort and conscience for belonging. Hitler did not simply deceive millions. He exposed how fragile truth becomes when fear enters the human heart. That is why this story still breathes beneath the surface of modern life. Because the shadows never truly vanished. They only learned new language, new symbols, new ways to make hatred feel righteous. If this truth weighs on your heart tonight, leave a sign below. A thought, a question, a warning for the future. And subscribe to Dark Ages History, where we do not study the past to escape reality, but to recognize the darkness before it speaks again. Because somewhere, even now, history is waiting for another frightened crowd, and another voice promising certainty in exchange for conscience.